dedication for all the soldiers fighting to protect Eretz Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and Medinat Yisrael. Let them be successful in their mission, return home safely, and also for the safe return of the hostages and refuah shlema for the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. So just one thing here. This week's parashat discusses, amongst other things, the incident of where Joseph's brothers didn't like his dreams, and they were jealous of him, and they threw him in the pit. Reuven pleaded with them not to kill him, not to harm him, and he went away, and he came back, and Joseph disappeared. Joseph was not in the pit. And then it says here, when Reuven returned to the well, Joseph was no longer there, and he tore his clothes in grief. The question I thought of, Joseph didn't die. There was no evidence that he had died. So why did he tear his clothes in grief? Anyone have an answer? And the brothers then dipped the coat, the Technicolor dream coat, in blood, and showed it to Jacob, and they said to Jacob. Jacob said, "Oh, Joseph must have died," but they never said it. But when Reuven came back, there was no evidence that Joseph had died, but he tore his clothes in grief. So why did he do that? Any question? 30 seconds. Anyone have any ideas? Gavin and Arthur, before Damon answers, because Gavin, what do you think?
Well, I'm quite happy to outsource this to Damon.
Arthur?
Same, yeah. No, I'm guessing it's got something to do with the fact that is that they messed up. So it was as if it was a death type of thing.
So the only thing I can guess, Kevin, the only thing I can guess is that three things. Is that firstly, the brothers thought he was dead. Only I think it was Reuven that suggested going in the pit because he knew Yosef was a tzaddik, and he realized he wouldn't have been killed by scorpions or snakes, but the others assumed he was dead, and therefore genuinely conveyed that emotion of saying not even Reuven was 100% sure his brother was a tzaddik, otherwise there would be no claim against him about the brothers bowing down to him. So they paskened as though they were a based in, and they said he's chayiv misa for the death penalty, so they all thought he died. They didn't realize that the pit would not affect a tzaddik with snakes and scorpions, so they all thought he was dead, and therefore they conveyed that emotion. And when Yaakov heard, and the immediate sadness hit in, the Ruach HaKodesh left him, where he couldn't divinely intuit if Yosef was alive, and therefore he wouldn't have been able to see that he was still alive. What's your explanations?
Yeah, those are very good, by the way. Especially the second one. Very, very powerful. I remember that. I've heard it before, but you put it all together nicely. Well done.
Kevin?
Yeah.
What is
I
your
can't
solution?
better what you just said.
Well, tell us what.
Well, as Gavin and Arthur said, we have to outsource it to you.
Okay, well, I tell you what, we don't have long to do the Gemara share. We've literally got about 10 minutes, 12 minutes. So let's
20 minutes.
Okay,
so 20 minutes. I'll stop it at exactly 20 minutes at 5:32. So at least you got 20 minutes. How's
all right.
it?
So how we ended off was a very simple explanation that Rav Yosef said, look, if it's before the owner's despair, there's a claim against the second party being the buyer in terms of having to have the return of the stolen goods without receiving compensation because the thief is identified. But after the point of Yeush, where there's despair combined with a change of domain, it belongs to the buyer, and once the thief is discovered, the victim can only sue the thief. So he was saying they're not in a disagreement. Rav, who said in the name of Rav Pia, who said you can only claim from the thief, and Rav Yochanan, who said in the name of Rav Yonah that you can claim from the thief or the buyer. So Rav Yosef explained a pre-Yeush situation and a post-Jewish situation, said there was no disagreement. Now, I'm just waiting for Kevin to be present. And what we're saying is that not everybody agrees with Rav Yosef. Abaye brought a challenge to him. No, Abaye as in A-B-A-Y-E, and not a purchaser Abaye, as Arthur quite funnily pointed out. And basically Abaye said that it's not necessarily the case, because there is a disagreement pre-Yush. And where can we see then evidence of this? In Chulin 132a, if you look in the Gemara, because there was a Mishnah that discussed these Kohanic gifts. So the Kohanic gifts that were sold to a non-Kohen, instead of being given directly to a Kohen, are similar to stolen goods that were sold before the owner's despair. Because at no point, if you look at Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 3, does a Kohen give up on getting back what he's entitled to, because we owe him, whether it's an ox, a sheep, or a goat, and you're getting the meat for non-sacrificial purposes, like you just want steaks and bra flesh and whatever, is that the Kohen still is entitled to the foreleg, the jaw, and the maw, which is your esophagus, your other parts within the jaw. So if a butcher slaughters an animal and then sells these Kohanic gifts and makes money off it, he's in fact stolen them from the Kohen. So it's equivalent to a pre-Yush situation, because the Kohen hasn't despaired of receiving what was rightfully his, according to Rashi. Okay, and yet we see that if one said to a butcher, "Sell me the innards of a cow," so it's a purchaser saying to a butcher, "I want the innards of a cow," and the Kohanic gifts were among them, the buyer gives the gifts to the Kohen, and the butcher does not deduct the value of the Kohanic gifts from the purchase price. Okay, I'll repeat this again. If a purchaser said to a butcher, "Sell me the innards of a cow," and the Kohanic gifts were among them, the buyer gives the gifts to a Kohen, and the butcher does not deduct the value of the Kohanic gifts from the purchase price, because basically the butcher presented him with all the innards, including the maw, which has to be given to the Kohen. And according to Rashi, it can only be assumed that that the maw and the foreleg and the jaw, etc., whether it's in the buyer's possession or the seller's possession, at the end of the day has to be given to the Kohen. So this case of the Mishnah doesn't involve the theft at all, because it never left the possession of the Kohen. In any event, the responsibility to give it to the Kohen now falls on the buyer. In the beginning, it fell on the butcher, and the reason it falls on the buyer now is because he currently has it. So that's not an issue. But now we're dealing with a separate case where it says, if, however, the purchaser bought the cow's innards from the butcher by weight, the purchaser gives the Kohanic gifts to the Kohen, and he deducts their value from the purchase price. So here we're talking about an incident. If the buyer or purchaser bought a certain weight of innards, the sale does include the maw. And that basically is a problem, because that's theft from the Kohen. Now the buyer must give the maw to the Kohen, and the Kohen doesn't have to pay him anything for whether it's the jaw, the foreleg, or the maw. Generally, the maw would be something that's not as noticed, whereas obviously a foreleg is a huge part of the animal, and the jaw would be. But a couple of pieces are not as identifiable. But either way, the Kohen doesn't owe the buyer anything, because if the buyer has a problem with the fact that he's paid for it from the butcher, he can claim from the butcher the money he paid for the maw. It wasn't the butcher's to sell. But he cannot demand from the Kohen, even pre-Yush, that he's entitled to get paid for it, because there was no Yush on the part of the Kohen. And what happened here was he was conned by the butcher. So the buyer's legal claim is against the butcher. But it's a different case that it can get a little complicated, because in a case where it wasn't the purchaser that basically weighed the Kohanic gifts. Okay, so in the first case, we dealt with the fact that it's the butcher's fault because he actually included parts that were given to the Kohen, charged for those parts, and the buyer bought him. So if the buyer has to give it back to the Kohen, he can claim it back from the butcher. So Rav said in explanation of the last ruling, which implies the buyer can collect compensation only from the butcher and not from the Kohen, it means that the Kohen doesn't have to recompensate the purchaser. So he says they taught that the buyer has no right to compensation from the Kohen, only where he weighed the innards for himself. Meaning, in this case, it was the buyer who initiated the theft of the mule and not the butcher, because he's the one that used the scale himself. It wasn't the butcher that tried to con the purchaser. He basically was going to keep it. And then the Kohen went back to him and said at the end of the day, listen, he wants his stuff. And he went to the buyer. In that case, it's obviously, in that case, he has no right to compensation from the client, from the Kohen. But if it was the butcher's fault, the claim of the Kohen is actually against the butcher directly, because he can sue only the butcher. If he wants to collect the gifts from the buyer, he's got to pay for them. So what we are saying is here, if it was the butcher who stole the mule, then the victim of the theft has a claim only on the thief himself, which is the butcher. So Rav maintains that the Kohen can sue only the butcher and not the buyer. Whereas Rav Yochanan is holding it the same as Rav Chisda, is that both parties are responsible, and the Kohen can either extract it from the buyer at no compensation, or alternatively from the butcher himself at no compensation. So they're holding it a different degree, and that contradicts Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef is turning around and saying, listen, pre-Yush, the only claim that the victim can have is against the thief and not the purchaser. But this issue is showing that a Kohen is entitled, he's a victim, because he's entitled to get his Kohanic gifts. That if the butcher stuffed him, Rav maintains that at the end of the day, his claim is against the butcher, and if he now needs to get it from the buyer, he has to pay the buyer for the Kohanic portion and then sue the butcher for the money in terms of compensation. Okay? But Rav Yochanan holds, according to Rav Chisda, that if this is the purchaser's fault, a claim is equally against the purchaser as it would be against the butcher, depending on who was at fault. So if the butcher accidentally sold it to the buyer, then the buyer would have to give the gifts to the Kohen and can sue the butcher. If it was because it's already in possession of the buyer. However, if it's and it's not entitled to compensation because the buyer was part of the problem. So that shows that Rav Yosef, according to Abaye, is not correct, because according to Rav Yosef, both Rav Yochanan and Rav say in a pre-Yush situation, you can sue either the buyer or the thief. But according to this opinion with the Kohanim, according to Abaye, it's not true. You can only pre-Yush sue the party that's actually caused the issue, according to Rav. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can any of you give it back to me?
Who's the strongest today? No one. I'm having a bad day, but I can give it a shot. But can't give it by buyer or by anything. It's just if he goes to the butchery and buys, if the what's it called? If the buyer buys the meat and it includes this this, what's the stuff called that you call it? These parts that are specific for
So
the
you call it
Kohen.
Kohanic gifts.
Yeah, Kohanic gifts. If he buys it and he was charged by the butcher with it, all incorporated, then it's the butcher's fault, not the buyer's fault. Okay, in which case the Kohen has recourse only against the buyer, not against the buyer. He has recourse against the butcher.
No, stop. Okay, there's an error. There's an error. So where the error lies is as follows: the Kohen can, according to Rav, the Kohen can get his gifts from either party according to who has possession of them. But in terms of who finally pays, it would be according to the person that messed up. So I just want to correct you on one thing.
Yes, okay, so I was kind of right. Yes, I was half right. 100%.
Yeah, you were.
Sorry.
So if the buyer,
I left out that part. Yes, that's important.
If Kevin, you the Cohen, okay, and it's so true, literally. So if I buy it from the butcher and I have the Kohanic gifts, I've got to hand it over to you. Okay, it's pre-Yush. There's nothing to consider because the butcher stiffed me. So my claim, according to one opinion, you can't take it from me. You can't take it from me because you'd have to pay me. What you can do is take it from me and pay me and sue the butcher. Okay, you can take it from me and sue the butcher. So your claim, according to Rav, is only against the butcher, but you still have to pay me, which does not go with Rav Kirsta, who says that pre-Yush, it's the buyer's responsibility. I never sold it to myself. The butcher sold me things that they weren't allowed to. And I can't withhold it from the Cohen, but I can't give it up to the Cohen unless I get paid because I'm having a loss. It's not my responsibility in this case to sue the butcher. It's the Cohen's responsibility to pay me in the case when it's not my fault, and he can sue the butcher. In a case where I waited for myself as the butcher, as the buyer, then the Cohen says to me, "Pal, hand it over." I have to hand it over, and I need to take responsibility as the buyer. So it's only if I'm culpable that as that party I'd be responsible. Whereas Rav Chisda, he holds like Rav Yochanan, or Rav Yochanan holds like Rav Chisda, that the Kohen can go to the buyer or he can go to the butcher. And he says either way, you hand over the Kohanic gifts or you give me money. And the butcher and the buyer have to sort it out according to their respective responsibility. Shabbat. Get what I'm saying?
So this is the second example. So you're saying in the second example where the guy goes to the butchery and weighs it himself, and the butchery is not to blame at all, and he goes home with it, right? Then the Kohen can come collect. He can collect either way, whether the butchery makes a mistake. No, he can't.
He can only collect it from the buyer because it wasn't the butcher's fault.
No. I'm not talking about the money. So he can collect the innards or whatever you call it from the buyer, and the money he can collect only from. I'm talking about the money now. The second part. The money he could collect from either one, you said.
No, he doesn't have to. No. That's why I know something went wrong. So let me just.
That's why I'm trying to check you because that's what it sounded like you just said.
Okay, so listen, I'm happy to repeat it. Let's just deal with Rav Chisda first, Rav Yosef, and then it'll make sense because it's important we get this. Is initially what was said was simple, is that Rav turned around, who said in the name of Rav Chia, there's only a claim against the thief if the thief's identity is revealed, because in that particular case, there's no, in that particular case, you know who the thief is. And the reason why he doesn't hold according to Rav Yochanan in the name of Rav Yanai, who says that the claim of the owner is against the second one, the buyer, is according to Rav, he's saying, look, the buyer now knows who the thief is, whom he bought it from. They've identified them at the Rosebank flea market. And therefore, the buyer should have been more aware where he purchased it from. Let him sue the shop owner for the theft. It's not the victim's problem. He didn't do anything wrong. According to Rav, according to Rav, the claim is only against the thief. According to Rav Yochanan, the victim can sue both the second one, the purchaser, as well as the original victim. Now you're saying, is there a case where there's compensation for the remedy of the marketplace? That's a separate issue. Because if the identity of the thief is not known, the buyer has no recourse, and therefore the victim has to compensate the buyer if he wants his things back, and they're that sentimental. When the thief is revealed, the buyer has to hand it over, according to Rav Yochanan, if he has it in his possession, but he's not entitled to compensate the buyer, because the buyer now can sue the thief, because the thief, who's the shop owner, his identity has been revealed. And Rav Yosef said that there's actually no dispute between Rav and Rav Yochanan, because Rav is saying that you can only sue the thief. Rav Yochanan is saying you can sue the thief or the buyer. And Rav Yosef says, listen, you're dealing with the pre-Yush situation. And the reason why you're dealing with the pre-Yush situation is if there's no despair on the part of the victim, nor change of domain, or even if there's a change of domain but not despair, the buyer hasn't acquired it. So therefore the buyer is the third party who consumed it and deprived the original owner of what is his, if it was a consumable or whatever the case may be, is as responsible as the actual thief, because either way the victim is deprived. So in pre-Yush, there's no way that the buyer could acquire it. Okay, and they have to make remedy. Therefore, the original victim can sue both the buyer as well as the thief. Not both, either or. But that's on a pre-Yush situation. And they both agree, according to Rav Yosef, both Rav and Rav Yochanan. According to post-Yush, they disagree. They don't disagree either, because post-Yush, the buyer has actually acquired it based on despair on the part of the victim, as well as a change of domain. Therefore, you can't sue the buyer. It belongs to the buyer. The only one you can sue is the thief. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's Rav Yosef. And the buyer's turning around, Abaye, and he says to Rav Yosef, that's not the case. You want to talk about a post-Yush, and the fact of it is Rav and Rav Yochanan agree, saying they don't agree necessarily. Because if you're looking at that Mishnah in 132a in Kalim, you deal with Kohanic gifts. No despair on behalf of the Kohen, because the Kohen's expecting what's his. So it can be one of two people's faults. It could be the butcher's fault, who decides instead of giving that Kohanic gift to the Kohen, he's going to make money on it and sell it to the buyer. And when he sells it to the buyer or the purchaser, either way, the Kohen can take it in that particular case, according to Rav Yochanan, can take it from either party, because at the end of the day, he's entitled to it. But then the buyer would have to sue the butcher because he's out of pocket. But according to Rav said no. If it's the butcher's fault, he can't sue the buyer. He basically, if it's the butcher's fault, can get it from the buyer and pay for it, but he can then only sue the butcher for the money back, because it was the butcher.
So Damon, I have to go. Thanks, I have to go. Cheers.
All right,
thanks.
sure. So you can only, do you get what I'm saying? So the buyer has to hand it over either way, but he has to be paid for it. And then the obligation is the Kohen can sue the butcher. That's according to Rav, because it's his fault. If the buyer weighed the innards for himself, it's the buyer's fault, and he has to hand it over. And either way, he doesn't get compensated. So according to Rav, you can't expect the buyer to hand it over without compensation if it was the butcher's fault. According to Rav Yochanan, both the buyer or the thief has to hand it over, either one, whoever's in possession of it, and there's no compensation. If there's any issue, it's the buyer that needs to sue the butcher if the butcher charged for something that should have been given to the Kohen. That's all we say.